Section 19 of Red Rubber, the story of the rubber slave trade on the Congo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. Red Rubber, the story of the rubber slave trade on the Congo by Edmund Dene Morel. Section 19. The Duty. The position of Belgium. We are, therefore, armed. It is not the power to act, but the will to act, which the government lacks, and I must add that I do not expect much from it, because the characteristic of its policy during the last few years has been complete acquiescence in everything which the sovereign of the Congo state has done. N. van der Velde, 1906. Not reform, but revolution. Not the apothecary, but the surgeon. Not poulticing, but removal. Can the European people over whom King Leopold, a foreigner to them, rules as constitutional monarch and whom he in his heart despises, can they apply the remedy? Can they tear the races of Central Africa from that relentless grasp? Are they able to do it? Were they able to do it, could they shoulder the burden of introducing justice and good government where for 15 long years massacre and pillage have gone hand in hand, a burden heavy, ungrateful, dangerous for so small a people, the more dangerous since their mental outlook on colonial enterprise has been greatly poisoned and corroded by the fetid example placed before them? Between England and Belgium cling historical ties which make for the preservation of Belgium. The King of the Belgians is a bitter and malignant enemy of England. He has become so because England has supplied the pens and the voices which have exposed his African undertaking. But in England, if there is no particular admiration for, there is no hostility to the Belgian people. Almost everywhere among us it is recognised that they have been misled as to sentiment, duped as to motives, misinformed as to facts, irresponsible as to action, foully betrayed by carefully combined cooperation in intrigue. Hence it is that a very general feeling prevails in this country, in official circles, and outside them, that annexation by Belgium would constitute a solution, most to be desired on varying grounds, of the Congo outrage. This hope has been frequently expressed. Let us then examine the possibilities. But in God's name, let our examination rest upon and start from the real issue at stake, the salvation of the Congo races from the rubber slave trade. Do not let us be decoyed by what may prove a mirage, capitulate before an idea merely because it appears attractive. A hideous mistake was committed 22 years ago. It must not be repeated. The Congo natives have paid too heavy a price to international thoughtlessness to be again sacrificed. Moreover, if we could suppose Belgium running the Congo on Leopoldian lines, such a condition of things would become a grave danger to the cause of international peace. What is the position of Belgium with regard to the Congo today? It is an extraordinary position, and in many respects a most humiliating one. Belgium has no legal rights whatsoever over the King's enterprise, which, so far as she is concerned, is a foreign state, outside the control or supervision of the Belgian Parliament and people. Belgium cannot even insist upon information being tendered to her as to the financial and general management of that enterprise by the King's Brussels staff, although Belgium has loaned over 1 million sterling to King Leopold as African sovereign, on which she receives no interest, and although she lends King Leopold the officers of her army to assist him in maintaining the rubber slave trade, and had diplomatists and consuls to defend it. This state of affairs has been brought about by the subservience to the royal will of Monsieur de Smet Deneer, the Belgian Premier, who in all matters relating to the Congo has placed the interests of King Leopold first, and the interests of Belgium a long way afterwards. This, his lengthened tenure of office, due to the break-up of the old Liberal Party, the fear of socialist legislation among the middle classes, and the preponderance of the voting power of those classes at the polls, owing to the existing elective system, and the undoubted increase in the country's prosperity, has enabled M. de Smet-Denayer to do with impunity. He has been in power 23 years, covering the whole period of the rise and enforcement of the rubber slave trade. M. de Smet-Denayer's predecessors were, to some extent at any rate, independent of the king's influence, but his docility has been remarkable, and as a reward he has been ennobled, a privilege never granted to his forerunners, although men of far greater personality and mental calibre. Believed to be above reproach in his private life, politically he is the king's creature, and the members of his cabinet are mere figureheads. It is a puppet government of which the strings are pulled by the king who, through the veil of a constitutional monarchy, exercises with increasing force a despotic will, riding roughshod over constitutional foundations. Never was the monarch's trend of mind in this regard shown more clearly than in his recent manifesto, in which he lays down the law in matters affecting the interests of Belgium as though no constitutional formulae and limitations existed. The events which have led up to the position in which Belgium finds herself in regard to the Congo may be briefly summarized. After he had obtained the separate and collective recognition of his African enterprise from the United States of America and the European powers, King Leopold applied for the sanction of the Belgian Chambers to his assuming the title of Sovereign of the Congo State. This fusion of the two crowns, as it is called, was secured, not without opposition, by that Belgian statesman whose high reputation extends beyond the boundaries of his country, Monsieur Bernard. It will be borne in mind that in those days the king proclaimed, as he still proclaims mirabile dictu, that he was working solely in the interests of Belgium. In a letter to Monsieur Bernard, dated August 5, 1889, the king communicated to that statesman a will bequeathing to Belgium after his death all his sovereign rights over the Congo, as they are recognized by the declarations, conventions, and treaties concluded since 1884 between the foreign powers on the one side, the International Association of the Congo, and the independent state of the Congo on the other. The words italicized should be carefully retained. The king's sovereign rights were indeed recognized, but the interpretation which the king has since placed upon those sovereign rights has not been recognized. It has been repudiated emphatically by the British government, and were the same interpretation adopted by his possible successor, that repudiation, with all that it involves, would hold good. The king intimated in the above letter that, if before his death it should be agreeable to the country, i.e. Belgium, to establish closer links with the Congo, I should not hesitate to place them at its disposal. I should be happy to see it, our African work, during my lifetime in the full enjoyment of their possession. This free gift of the Congo to Belgium by a patriotic monarch was accepted by the Belgian Chambers in July 1890 on the following terms. Belgium was to have the right to annex the Congo at any time within the ensuing 10 years. She was to advance £1 million to the King's enterprise, paying £200,000 down and £80,000 per annum during the specified period. No interest was to be demanded from the King, but if at the expiration of the agreement Belgium refused definitely to annex, then the loan would bear interest at 3.5%. No further financial liabilities were to be incurred by the King without the assent of the Belgian Chambers, a most reasonable proviso, since Belgium, from that date onwards, stood in the light of prospective heir, and one which a monarch working in the interests of Belgium was bound to observe, apart from his plighted word. This free gift, then, was secured by Belgium at a first cost of £1 million plus interest to the Belgian taxpayer. In 1898, the Count de Merode-Westerlo brought forward an annexation project. The king worked against it secretly, and the socialists opposed it with the greatest violence, especially when it transpired in the course of the debate that the king had broken his word, had borrowed £250,000 from Monsieur de Brown de Thiège, that the time limit was about to expire, and that with its expiration this astute banker would come into possession for ever of a slice of territory, according to the terms of his private bargain with the king, on the Congo, 5 times the size of Belgium. The patriotism of King Leopold was equal already, it will be observed, to the alienation of a substantial portion of the patrimony of his prospective heir. The annexation project was withdrawn, and the Chambers voted the money required to keep out Monsieur de Brown de Thiège. Thus, this free gift was secured at a second cost of £250,000, total cost up to 1895, £1,250,000 plus interest to the Belgian taxpayer. When the time limit approached for the expiration of the agreement of 1890, i.e. in 1901, Monsieur Bernard drafted and presented an annexation bill. The government appeared at first to acquiesce. The socialists opposed, but the liberal leaders were in favour, and Monsieur Bernard's bill was assured of a large majority. Then came the king's dramatic intervention. The infamous decrees of 1891-2, which had converted the Congo state into a piratical undertaking and drenched the Congo territories with blood, had also resulted in the acquisition of enormous revenues, and many more were in store. Future prospects were brilliant. The king was no longer eager to place the Congo in the hands of the Belgian people, no longer anxious to give them the full enjoyment of his patriotic schemes. He addressed a letter to Monsieur Wurster, one of the leaders of the clerical majority, and as devoted a henchman as Monsieur de Smet-Denaire, who communicated it to an astonished house. It was blunt, autocratic, to the point. If annexation were voted, then, that is to say, before the time has come when annexation can give to Belgium all the benefits which I wish to assure her, the sovereign would refuse to administer the Congo during the inevitable interregnum. In other words, he would withdraw the whole machinery of government. The annexationists were nonplussed. The cabinet went over to the king. No law existed for the governing of colonial possessions. The absolutism of the King's Act was glossed over by the government depositing a projected law for the above purpose. The Belgian chambers were powerless. The time limit expired. With it, even the shadowy control formerly exercised by Belgium over the King's African enterprise expired also, and the latter became completely independent. The chambers had to bow to the inevitable, but not without many a speech of indignant and weighty protest. The liberal leaders declared that their acquiescence was the acquiescence of resignation, a solution which in our view is essentially provisional. Monsieur de Lanchier, a prominent member of the clerical majority, exclaimed, "The new position which has been created for us, and which totally excludes Belgium from any intervention in Congo affairs, is going to place us in an untenable situation, to undergo all liabilities without our having the least power or the least liberty of action. No one in the world has ever consented to accept a responsibility which excludes the right of action and liberty. From the Belgian point of view, it will be liability for the acts of others. From the foreign point of view, it will remain our liability." But the king got his own way, thanks to Monsieur de Smet-Denaire, who has pigeonholed his projected law for the government of the colonial possessions of Belgium ever since, although urgency was claimed for it at the time, and the situation today is that which it has been since 1901, that which Monsieur Bernard described it to be in the debate of last March. We can no longer obtain accounts or information of any kind, and, notwithstanding our triple position of presumptive heirs, furnishers of men and money, and creditors, we are, from the judicial point of view, in exactly the same situation towards the Congo as the other states represented at the Conference of Berlin, which declaration Monsieur de Smet-Denaire endorsed by the words, "That is quite accurate." When we discuss Congo affairs here, remarked Mr. Hymans, one of the foremost leaders of the Liberal Party, in the course of the aforesaid debate, the government declares itself incompetent to reply, and immediately afterwards we see the same minister, who has sheltered himself behind this non possumus, speak and explain himself not as a minister of the Belgian government, but as an advocate of the Congo state. I do not understand how the head of a government does not realize how abnormal and shocking such a situation is. In the course of the March 1906 debate to which I have referred, the Belgian Chamber passed a resolution in favour of proceeding without delay to the projected law on the administration of the colonial possessions of Belgium. The Chamber meets in November. Meanwhile, King Leopold, frightened for his revenues, has again flung out an ultimatum, fitting pendant to that of 1901. In his manifesto, he roundly declares that if Belgium ever annexes the Congo, she must respect all engagements which he may have made with third parties. She must inherit the obligations to diminish in no manner the integral revenues or the domaine privé and domaine de la couronne. As for the domaine de la couronne, its revenues are forever inalienable. In other words, Belgium must bind herself to maintain unimpaired the atrocious system of pillage and grinding oppression under which these revenues are acquired and which would disappear with the disappearance of that system. Her control must be forever excluded from the domaine de la couronne, e.g. from a portion of the Congo 10 times the size of Belgium. She must take over all the debts which the king has contracted and respect existing rubber companies whose administrators are co-partners with the king. The king is good enough to add that in accordance with his immutable patriotism, he will allow Belgium to annex when he considers she is in a position to reap the fullest advantages from the Congo patrimony, but that if the members of his Brussels staff, to whom the manifesto is addressed, are respectfully asked when that happy moment is likely to arrive, they will reply that the patriotic monarch has nothing to say at present. What aspect does the free gift of 1889 take on in 1906? A. A free gift which the royal giver withholds ad infinitum. B. A free gift for which he has obtained £1,250,000 out of the Belgian taxpayer free of interest. C. A free gift which he has saddled with nominal liabilities, ex the above, of £9,700,000, and with positive liabilities, the amount of which he carefully conceals from his prospective heirs. D. A free gift, the potential value of which is decreasing every year with the blood-stained revenues he and his associates are drawing from it. E. A free gift for which he has acquired from Belgium the services of her officers, diplomatists and consuls, sheltered the infamies of his African rule in the folds of the Belgian flag, and in the name of patriotism sullied her fair fame throughout the world. Is there on record a similar instance of a trusting, ill-informed nation being swindled so outrageously and treated so contemptuously by a foreign monarch presiding over its destinies? The Congo enterprise has certainly created in Belgium a taste for foreign commercial expansion and has given an impetus to Belgian industry abroad. That is undeniable, but at what a price? So far as the Congo is concerned, Belgium as a nation derives little or no benefit from it. There is no trade with the natives. the produce of the country is extracted by force. Hence the exports from Belgium to the Congo are insignificant. On the other hand, the pernicious ideals of colonial policy introduced by the king have worked moral havoc among a section at least of the well-to-do bourgeois classes of the country. The army has become impregnated with a detestable virus. The old slave trade spirit has everywhere made inroads. The nemesis is certain, is indeed approaching with strides more rapid than most persons suppose. There are several other points of view to be considered, both Belgian and non-Belgian. What are the principal features of M. de Smet Denere's projected law? They are such that if annexation took place on those lines, nothing would be changed except that a colonial minister would replace a secretary, and that colonial minister might very possibly be M. de Smet Denere himself, to whom it is said King Leopold has offered the appointment under certain contingencies. The man who has declared as the pivotal basis and justification of an African undertaking that the native is entitled to nothing, would be a worthy successor to Messrs. de Cuvelier, Lebricht and Roegmans. M. de Smet Denere's projected law retains the whole civil, judicial, financial, military and administrative organisation created by the king. The king remains invested with the sole executive power. The finances are, as before, controlled by him absolutely. He drafts the budgets and registers the laws. The members of the judiciary are, as before, subject to the executive will and revocable ad nutum. The minister would have a seat in Parliament and could only be interrogated once a year when he presented his annual report. He would be, in effect, quite outside cabinet or parliamentary control, subject only to the king. It is easy to describe the dominating idea which presided over the elaboration of this project, to retain in the hands of the sovereign all colonial affairs, withhold the latter as far as possible from parliamentary interference, establish the financial independence of the colony. These, without a doubt, are the objects which its authors have had in view. In other words, Belgium would in appearance become responsible. In reality, she would, once more, be wax in the king's hands. It is, I think, inconceivable that annexation on this basis could be driven through the Belgian chamber, especially in view of the revelations of the Commission of Inquiry and of the contents of the recent manifesto, which seeks to bind down the Belgians to conditions which no people with an ounce of dignity could agree to. But assuming the incredible to happen, a solution such as this could not be accepted by public opinion outside of Belgium. In truth, it would be no solution, but an aggravation of existing evils, at least from the international point of view. Then there is another point, and a very pertinent one. Annexation of the Congo by Belgium on the Smet Denere Royal Manifesto basis I look upon, as I have said, as utterly impossible, and I do not think I shall be contradicted. But is a majority of the Belgian chamber prepared to annex at all, even on national lines which are not the king's lines? Even at the price of a conflict with the king, a conflict which would necessarily be of a most determined and implacable character? The liabilities, material and moral, are tremendous. Large sections of the country are economically exhausted. The decrease of the population is appalling. By a careful computation, but which of course can only be hypothetical, based upon accessible positive data relating to depopulation, an analysis of the whole evidence which has been accumulating since 1890, the ivory and rubber output, the quantities of staple food supplies wrung from the people, the spread of disease, etc., I estimate that in the last 15 years the population of the Congo has been decreasing at a minimum rate of 100,000 per annum, or say 1,500,000 in the past 15 years. I am convinced that is the very lowest computation compatible with accuracy. Consul Casemont considers it far too low. His opinion is that the last decade has witnessed a decline in the population by nearly 3 millions. Of the two opinions, his is likely to be the soundest, because he has seen with his own eyes the effects of the Leopoldian system upon communities which he knew in former years to be populous and thriving, and because he is a servant of the Crown with 20 years African experience. It will take at least 2, possibly 3 generations for the country to recover from the havoc of the last 15 years. If the Congo is to be administered, not pirated, if the produce of the soil, e.g. the rubber and gum copal, is to be acquired in future by legitimate purchase instead of by pillage, then there will be an immense and immediate fall in the output and, concurrently, in the so-called public revenues. The native peoples in the exploited rubber zones are crushed, broken, sick unto death of the very name of rubber. Rubber is death. Vatafi bo leiwa has become the motto of these races. With the withdrawal from the villages of the armed sentry, backed by overwhelming force behind him, with the cessation of hostage-taking and the 101 other concomitants of the Leopoldian system, an immense sigh of relief would arise from the equatorial forest, and the natural reaction would set in. Commerce as a substitute for force would revive only by slow, very slow degrees, and for many years to come, even if the huge army were cut down 1/2 and strict economy exercised in other ways, Belgium could only hope to run her dependency at a heavy loss. The flow of gold from the Congo would be stopped, and the enterprises created from it and dependent upon its maintenance would collapse. Then again, the burden of debts, with which this free gift has been thoughtfully loaded by the giver for the greater benefit of the prospective heir, is such that, with the certainty of lean years ahead under decent administration, any Belgian statesman worthy of the name would hesitate once, twice, and yet again before asking the country to assume it. Thoughtful Belgians are reckoning all this up. They realise that the temporary prosperity of the Congo, that is to say, what passes for prosperity, the gold in the shape of rubber rolling out of it, depends exclusively upon the system of oppression and tyranny to which the natives are subjected. They know that the public edifices which are being reared in Brussels as an advertisement for the king, out of Congo rubber and Congo loans, and which Belgium does not require, Belgium will have to pay for if she annexes, and pay through the nose, for since they have been constructed regardless of economy. They know that with every year that passes, the indebtedness of the king's enterprise increases, and with it the prospective liabilities of Belgium. They know that money has been borrowed at 28% discount, and that Belgium, if she annexes, will be mulcted to that extent with the bankers who have financed the king. Such, then, is the position in which Belgium finds herself, thanks to the complicity of her government with Leopold Africanus. The clerical, or conservative party, has blindly followed Monsieur de Smet-Deneyer at the price of the abandonment by the king of his former agitation in favour of the personal military system of which he was once so strong an advocate. It has given him carte blanche so far as the Congo is concerned, and only now is that party beginning to realise the abyss which yawns beneath its feet and the country's. On the one hand, annexation appears the only escape from the intolerable moral position which leaves Belgium besmirched by the acts of others, as Monsieur de Lanchier predicted 5 years ago. But annexation on lines compatible with self-respect and common sense is barred by the king, and short of a complete capitulation on his part, could be forced through only by a definite rupture between sovereign and parliament. On the other hand, annexation even at the price of a rupture appears, the more closely it is looked at, as a highly questionable proceeding in the light of national interests. Repudiation, absolute and entire, would carry with it of necessity the withdrawal of all Belgian officers from the Congo army, following the example of Italy, and the sundering of all diplomatic connections with the King's African enterprise. And this, of course, would also spell a definite rupture. Amidst all this fog of doubt and uncertainty in which the Belgian people find themselves enfolded, a question is beginning to form itself on the lips of men. The fusion of the two crowns was acquiesced in by the nation. A nation can revoke the assent secured under false pretences. Can the wearer of the Belgian crown be allowed any longer to continue the holder of the Congo sovereignty? If King Leopold does not abate his pretensions, that question may well be answered by a negative, which might have results more far-reaching than the elevation, before natural causes called for it, of Prince Albert to the throne of Belgium. End of section 19.
Section 20 of Red Rubber, The Story of the Rubber Slave Trade on the Congo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Omar Raymond. Red Rubber, The Story of the Rubber Slave Trade on the Congo by Edmund Dene Morel. The Duty, What Britain Can Do, Part 1. What Great Britain Can Do. Extracts from speeches in the House of Commons and House of Lords. It had always been the boast of this country, not only that our own native subjects will govern on principles of justice, but that ever since the days of Wilberforce, England had been the leader in all movements on behalf of the backward races of the earth. Here was an occasion when those responsible for our policy, basing themselves on a treaty publicly and solemnly made, might pursue those great traditions, and by taking the initiative in this matter might add to the annals of the good deeds of the country. Mr. Herbert Samuel, 1903. It was obvious that there was a complete enslavement of the whole population. As the suppressors of slavery and the slave trade, we had always led Europe and had the highest degree of responsibility under the engagement of the powers at Berlin to watch over the execution of the Berlin Act for the protection of the natives. Sir Charles Dilke, 1903. The treaties made between the Congo state and ourselves had undoubtedly been overridden, and therefore he supposed the Under-Secretary for Foreign Affairs would not deny their right to interfere. Then arose the question, was it expedient that they should do so? His answer to that was in the affirmative. Sir John Gerst, 1903. He thought we could do something alone. Mr. Alfred Emmett, 1903. He altogether denied that they could deal with the Congo state as if it were a state like France, Austria, Germany, or any other power. The Congo Free State was an artificial creation. Lord Fitzmaurice, 1903. In face of the facts which are now officially admitted, he asked the House whether the time was not come when they should sweep away all the difficulties which stood in the way and force the government to take stronger action than mere words and dispatches to deal with this horrible scandal. Sir Charles Dilke, 1904. He was driven to the conclusion, therefore, that the only remedy was for the public opinion of Europe, and particularly of this country, to bring into force the clause of the Convention under which the Free State was founded. Mr. Austin Taylor, 1904. The Congo Free State lay absolutely at the mercy of this country or any other country which chose to say it would occupy the capital at Boma in the name of civilization. Lord Fitzmaurice, 1904. There has never been a policy of which it might be said as truly as of this one that it was the policy not so much of His Majesty's government as the policy of the House of Commons. Lord Percy, 1904. He did not think any of the great European powers, with the facts so clearly established as they now were, ought to be content, in view of their own honour in the matter, to sit still and do nothing. Sir Edward Grey, 1904. Our own position in Africa must be considered. The infamous treatment of the natives in the Congo Free State must affect the position of the natives throughout Africa. The knowledge of the injustice inflicted upon the natives in the Congo Free State was carried by those subterranean wires which all natives employed from one part of the continent to the other, and was bound to affect the condition of the natives under the British, German and French flags. Sir Gilbert Parker, 1906. We held a national responsibility. the right of intervention seemed to him to be clear beyond dispute. Sir Charles Dilke, 1906. Apart altogether from treaty obligations, every state interested in any portion of the territory of the Congo comprised in the Convention had not only the right, but was under the obligation, from the point of view of self-interest, to consider how far the present system of misgovernment carried with it a serious menace to the reputation and even to the security of the European governments. Lord Percy, 1906. But I may add, quite irrespective of any right we enjoy under the letter of these acts, that we have a moral right to interfere, which comes to us in consequence of the false pretences, I cannot use a gentler word, under which the Congo state has acquired its privileged position in that part of Africa. Lord Lansdowne, 1906. In the last 3 chapters, I've endeavoured to establish that from King Leopold no alteration in the existing state of affairs on the Congo is to be looked for, that to expect reform from that quarter would be puerile, that reform can only come with a sweeping removal of the cause of the evil by cauterizing the evil at its roots. If there ever was a case where the old French adage, il faut frapper à la tête, applied, surely this is one. I've tried to show also how extremely difficult, not to say virtually helpless, short of a complete rupture between King and Parliament, is a position of Belgium, and how foolish it would be to regard Belgian annexation as a certain panacea within the pale of practical politics, or even as a necessarily certain panacea if it were within that pale. Hostility to a Belgian annexation of the Congo on the lines laid down by the Berlin and Brussels Acts, there is none in this country. But it is obvious that agreement to a Belgian annexation on the lines laid down by the King is utterly impossible. The neutrality of Belgium is guaranteed by the powers in the interest of international peace. The neutrality of a Belgian colony embracing the great heart of Africa and run like a slave farm through the medium of an ever-growing native soldiery armed with weapons of precision could be recognized by no power with tropical dependencies contiguous to its frontiers. As it is, the policy of laissez-faire adopted by the signatory powers of the Act of the West African Conference of 1885, having possessed in tropical Africa, in permitting the evolution of an international association for the promotion of civilization and commerce, from a Congo free state to a military despotism resting upon slavery and rifles, is incredibly short-sighted. To allow such a condition of things to continue, with the substitution of the Belgian for the Congo flag of King Leopold, would be insensate. Apart from all questions of humanity and legitimate political interest in Europe, acquiesce would imperil Belgian neutrality in Europe. Of that, no one who understands this grave question can entertain the slightest doubt. But after all, we have not to consider possibilities, but actualities. Discussion, passionate or otherwise, can be renewed and yet again renewed in the Belgian Parliament. The projected law on the colonial possessions of Belgium may give rise to endless debates. Compared with the existing facts, all this is academic. Existing facts they are which confront us, which call out for immediate solution, drastic and thorough. The rubber slave trade flourishes, unchecked, unimpaired, unaltered by all the talk and ink spilling of the last 4 years. It has been exposed in all its horrors, but it is in being. Its activity has been stimulated by a sense of precariousness in the future. Its area of devastation increases, and with it the number of victims. That is the immediate consideration. All else is subsidiary. The year 1907 is a great anniversary, bringing with it a flood of recollections. The 26th of March 1907 will be in the centenary of the royal assent to the bill passed in both Houses of Parliament abolishing the overseas slave trade. From the ashes of an international conference, summoned in the name of Almighty God, has sprung a traffic in African misery more devilish than the old, more destructive, more permanently ruinous in its cumulative effects. A British government, a Liberal government, with many misgivings but with the best of intentions, by its active participation in that conference, and by its adhesion to the conclusions thereof, incurred a responsibility which cannot be set aside. Today, a British government, a Liberal government, is in power with an enormous majority, strong and respected abroad, and has been given a mandate by a democratic parliament, convinced and unanimous to deal with this new form of the African slave trade, which the cupidity and the baneful ambitions of one man have reared in the heart of Africa. Behind a unanimous parliament stands a united press. This government and its predecessor in office have both alike addressed numerous protests to the author of the evil, publicly and privately, protests which have not merely been ignored in the sense of effecting improvement, but treated with contempt so marked as to be perilously akin to insult. The evil continues. This government and its predecessor in office have both alike held their hand when they could have struck hard and swift and in strict conformity with the treaty rights of Great Britain. The evil continues. 2 years ago, the predecessor of the present government invited formally the cooperation of the other signatories to the West African Conference of 1885 to join with them in handling this evil, but the invitation was not accepted. The evil continues. A few months ago, the present government reiterated informally that invitation. The evil continues, and the author of the evil, in an insolent manifesto addressed to his secretaries and directed at Great Britain, has defied the British government to carry out the mandate given to it by Parliament, placing himself above the reach of pledges and the law of nations. And the great anniversary is upon us. We have put our hands to the plough. We cannot draw back. For the sake of our dignity as a great nation, for the sake of our traditions as the emancipators of the races of Africa, as an African power having legitimate interest to maintain, we cannot wait forever. But have we not waited long enough? Surely the cup is full and overflowing. Internationally, our position has seldom been stronger, nor the home popularity which would attend positive action more assured to our government from every section or public opinion. So strong indeed do we consider ourselves to be from this country, from its foreign minister, has come the first clear proposal for a reduction in the world's armaments. From this country, from its premier and leader in the mother of parliaments, has come a message of sympathy addressed to the youngest of parliaments under circumstances which make of that message an historic pronouncement in favour of the liberties of men. Are we then not strong enough to rescue the races of Central Africa from enslavement and destruction at the hands of the man to whom we entrusted their destinies? While we wait, they perish, and there is no reason why they should. No interests of a great misguided nation are concerned. No sentiments imbued in generations of thought have to be rooted up and educated out of existence. No cataclysm in world politics hangs in the balance. No onrush of religious fanaticism is to be apprehended. Action to stay the extirpation of these African peoples is attended by none of the perils bound up with the conflicting international claims and racial animosities, which make a satisfactory settlement of the Eastern question so difficult. There is action we ourselves can take in virtue of treaty rights, which in itself would almost of necessity give rise automatically to a renewed international conference. What is that action? Let us turn to the declarations exchanged and the convention passed with the representative of King Leopold in 1884. We recognize the flag of the International Association on specific grounds. What were they? That the association had come into existence for the purpose of promoting the civilization and commerce of Africa and for other humane and benevolent purposes. 22 years later, we find that King Leopold's enterprise consists not in promoting civilization and commerce, but, as admirably defined by Lord Percy in the House of Commons, in the accumulation of rubber at an infinite cost of human life and suffering. For mercenary motives, to quote Lord Lansdowne, we have been grossly deceived, therefore, and in that deception practised upon us resides a prima facie case for declining any longer to regard King Leopold's African flag as the emblem of a civilized administration. An administration whose object is to accumulate rubber at an infinite cost to human life and suffering, as deliberately stated in the British House of Commons by the Under-Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, has no call upon a recognition in any case, still less so when such an object is totally at variance with solemn pledges made to us in the past. The steamers which King Leopold employs under his African flag can be declined admittance to British territorial waters. At present they enter our ports, and at the most the Treasury would lose £1,000 per annum in the light dues and other port charges they pay. Not the most virulent lady-hater of Mr. Asquith would attribute to him a desire to oppose the performance of a national duty for the sake of £1,000. The nominees King Leopold has appointed to represent exclusively his African interests in this country can be informed that we no longer recognise them. In other words, the exequatur can be withdrawn from the 3 or 4 Congo Free State consuls who carry on their royal master's behests in England and in Scotland and whose offices were until recently, when public attention was drawn to the fact, distributing centres for the scurrilous publications of the Press Bureau. It is a scandal that one of these consuls should be an Englishman and the president of a leading British Chamber of Commerce. Other measures are open to us. Those I have denoted are the mildest, and absolutely no impediment stands in the way of their realisation. I pass to the Convention. What are our rights under that Convention? They are 1. That until sufficient provision shall have been made for the administration of justice on the Congo, the sole and exclusive jurisdiction, both civil and criminal, over the persons and property of British subjects shall be vested in British consular officers in accordance with British law. Article 5. This is called consular jurisdiction, or the exercise of rights of extraterritoriality. They are 2. That British subjects are entitled at all times to sojourn and establish themselves, are entitled to enjoy the rights of buying, selling, letting and hiring lands, buildings, mines and forests, founding houses of commerce, carrying on commerce under the British flag. They are entitled to protection in their persons, property, free exercise of religion, navigation, commerce and industry. Article 2. Very good. These pledges have not been kept. The need for British consular jurisdiction for the protection of our own subjects in King Leopold's estate is nowhere, and by no one disputed in this country. The present government does not dispute it. The past government did not dispute it. Speaking in office, Lord Percy said on June 9, 1904, "The only practicable suggestion which, I think, has been made this afternoon is that this country should revive its claim to the exercise of extraterritorial jurisdiction in the Congo state." Sir Edward Grey, speaking in opposition on the same occasion, concurred. He thought we might put the establishment of consuls with consular jurisdiction on the ground that if other powers would not cooperate with us in this matter, in what we considered the general interests of humanity and civilization, which were as much theirs as ours, we must, at any rate, see to the protection of our own subjects. Speaking in July last, Sir Edward Grey said, "The time must come when we shall have to consider whether these rights should not be exercised." On the same occasion, Lord Lansdowne said, "All I can say is that I hope, if these abuses continue, we shall claim our right to appoint consuls with consular jurisdiction in the Congo. At the very least, 100 public meetings, including 2 towns meetings in Liverpool and Sheffield, held throughout England and Scotland in the last 2 years, have passed resolutions urging this step upon the government. The marvel is that it was not taken years and years ago. British coloured subjects ill-treated, flogged and shot, an Englishman hung out a hand, a British consul so busy for 2 years inquiring into grave abuses perpetrated towards British coloured subjects in the very neighbourhood of the capital of the Congo itself as to be unable to stir from the spot, and all this while a weapon lies rusting in our grasp. And now King Leopold's anger is turned upon the British missionaries. His so-called administration of justice is utilised to entrap and browbeat them. His object, to terrify them into silence. Furious that they have convinced his own commission, they whom his press bureau and his Brussels staff have reviled with every opprobrious epithet, which placed on record that the natives had come to regard them as the sole representatives of justice and equity in the country, and still we hesitate. To leave these brave men, they are not all brave, perhaps, but many of them are, and to those who have spoken out, humanity owes a debt of gratitude. To leave them at the mercy of Congo justice is to acquiesce in their dragooning, is to show them that whatever the British public may think of their devotion in their cause of right, a British government which tomorrow can ensure for them absolute security from molestation of any kind looks askance upon their intolerable situation. Our duty towards these men is clear, and our duty towards the 2,000 coloured subjects of the Crown on the Congo is equally emphatic. They are entitled to claim protection, cuis Romanum sunt. The case for consular jurisdiction for our own subjects is, on the face of it, overwhelming. But consular jurisdiction has several other sides to it. Cases have occurred of British coloured subjects being employed as subordinate agents in charge of outstations in the bush, rubber stations, and having committed, or allowed to be committed, in that capacity the brutalities which are inseparable from such work, and having been sentenced by the Congo courts, whose severity towards such virtually helpless victims of the system is proportionate to the criminal laxity shown towards the real guilty parties, the European representatives of the king and his trusts, whose instructions the former must needs obey. There is a tendency on the part of the Foreign Office to adopt a high moral, wash our hands sort of attitude in regard to British coloured subjects thus involved. Several questions which I have caused to be put in the House relating to specific cases which came under my notice have been greeted as though there was something shocking and irregular in the slightest exhibition of concern in the fate of such unfortunates. It is an attitude with which I am wholly unable to agree. So long as the Congo judicial system is what it is, vide Section 3, so long will there be no thorough investigation into outrages perpetrated by or through the orders of persons directly or indirectly connected with the executive, and so long will the Congo courts fail to deal competently with cases of British coloured subjects who from time to time may find themselves mixed up in such outrages. Take, for example, the case of Sylvanus Jones, a native of Lagos and a subordinate of the man Caudron, vide Section 3. If that case had been brought before a British court, it would have yielded clear evidence of the moral complicity of the Supreme Executive. That evidence is, indeed, afforded by the verdict of the court itself, but is purposely obscured by the refusal of the court to pronounce an opinion on the admissions showing executive toleration for the deeds which the accused, acting under the direct orders of his immediate chief, Caudron, who himself acted in cooperation with the local sub-chief of police, is alleged to have committed. The vital point is this, that no British consular court would have pronounced judgment upon Sylvanus Jones without sifting to the bottom the responsibility for the acts sanctioned by him under the instruction of a European employer. Now, one of the most essential needs of the situation is the securing of positive documentary evidence in this regard, and British consular jurisdiction would be an invaluable and unique means to this end in cases like that of Sylvanus Jones. Consider too the personal aspect. A. The British consul in the Congo reports that Jones had no opportunity of engaging counsel, although he had enough money to do so if the option had been allowed him. B. He was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment for responsibility in the murder of one woman killed in the course of a raid upon a native village for shortage in rubber. C. Caudron, under whose orders he acted, was proved to have conducted raids which led to the positive murder of 200 people, of personally shooting a woman in the breast, of ordering a native chief to be shot in prison, etc., and only received 5 years imprisonment. The case of Cyrus Smith of Freetown is another in point. He had taken hostages, which, the reader will remember, the Governor-General himself has authorised and indeed recommended upon numerous occasions for shortage in rubber, and the hostages, most of them women and children, had died of hunger. His defence was a simple one. He had nothing to give them to eat. Atrocious as this bold statement sounds, let the reader turn to the admissions made by the Commission of Inquiry, sections 3 and 4, in connection with the food taxes, and bear in mind that such things as women dying in prison of starvation are all part and parcel of, inevitable incidents in, a vast system of criminal oppression to obtain revenues by armed force for private ends. The court which tried him and sentenced him found that he too was acting with the toleration of the authorities in taking hostages. I repeat, then, that far from putting on a mantle of superior righteousness over these cases, it is the bounden duty of the British government to provide machinery requisite for plumbing them to their deepest depths. So far we've considered consular jurisdiction mainly in the light of the legitimate interests of British subjects, and to this I shall refer again in dealing with the missionary question, but as a means of coping with the paramount evil, the ill treatment of the natives of the country, the efficacy of British consular courts can be doubted only by those who have not examined the subject. I do not care in the least, said Lord Lansdowne last July, whether there are British subjects to look after or not, but what I do feel is that the presence of half a dozen Englishmen will be worth more than a whole row of inspectors or officials belonging to the administration of the Congo Free State. Precisely, but the contention can be amplified. A British Court of Justice, one set up on the Congo with sole jurisdiction over British subjects, civil and criminal, would hamper at every turn the working of the system of injustice perpetrated towards a people of the land. The aborigines would be profoundly impressed by the knowledge, of which they would receive ocular demonstration, that the humblest crew boy, the veriest steamer hand or carpenter boy of slave blood, was certain of absolute justice in the teeth of the highest in the land, provided he were a British subject. They would compare the position of such men with their own miserable existence, a position incomparably more secure than that of the oldest and most venerable indigenous chief. They would realize what white justice at its best really was, and with that revelation would arise in their crushed spirits the glimmerings of a new hope. The moral effect would react in 100 ways against the present regime. The independence in wrongdoing, the right to work iniquity, and fear no question would be struck at its very roots, in the face of a tribunal whose sole duty it would be to find the truth and proclaim it. It is impossible to suppose the present machinery of the Congo courts sitting side by side with the British court without producing results which, inter alia, the natives of the country would derive incalculable benefit. The moral effect in Europe of the establishment of British consular jurisdiction on the Congo would be immense. It would show the world that the British people were determined to mark, by a step whose significance could not be mistaken, their abhorrence of King Leopold's methods and their firm intention of passing from words to deeds. A right to so act is unquestionable, and if any of the signatory powers of the West African Conference were disposed to see in such a step a disquieting indication of exclusive British political interference in the affairs of the Congo, well, the remedy would lie with them. They could assent to our demand, made in the general interest of humanity, for an international conference. Moreover, they could copy our policy, for several of them stipulated in 1884 for the same rights as ourselves. Sir Edward Grey himself met that possible but unlikely difficulty in his usual straightforward manner 2 years ago. If the susceptibilities of other powers should be aroused by such action, he said, then by all means let them appoint consuls of their own, meaning, of course, as is clear from the text, consuls with consular jurisdiction, and for the rest we have, perhaps, consulted the susceptibilities of other powers too much in refraining from taking action which has been open to us, not as co-signatories of the Acts of the West African Conference, but under our own treaty rights with King Leopold, rights which can be contested by no power or powers. The sooner we show other powers that we are in earnest, the sooner will talk give way to something more practical. To obtain collective action, at which we aim, an individual lead is of paramount necessity. End of section 20. Recording by Omar Raymond.
Section 21 of Red Rubber, the story of the rubber slave trade on the Congo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. Red Rubber, the story of the rubber slave trade on the Congo by Edmund Dene Morel. Section 21, The Duty. What Great Britain Can Do, Part 2. What of our rights under Article 2 of the Convention? Commercial rights entailing the freedom of purchase and of sale, of buying and of leasing land, of every other thing needful to the prosecution of legitimate trade? I refer to the general commercial position later on, contenting myself at this stage with the remark that as commerce of any kind, by any one, was swept from the vast Upper Congo in 1891, so have our rights under that article been cynically infringed. What of the rights of British missions and missionaries under Article 2? How are they interpreted by King Leopold? I do not know the exact figures, but I think I shall be well within the mark in stating that the British missionary societies have spent some £300,000 on the Congo. From the purely secular aspect, this is a national interest which cannot be lightly ignored by a British government. The money thus expended has come out of the pockets of the British philanthropic public. It is entitled to consideration. Of late, King Leopold has quietly opposed the development and extension of all religious propaganda on the Congo, Roman Catholic and Protestant. It is true that he recently conferred special facilities upon an English Roman Catholic organisation, granting it sites in close proximity with a Protestant mission. But this is an exception, and was due to the expectation and the hope of affording an opportunity for sectarian controversy and to reap all the capital from that which was possible. To draw, as he has tried to do for long enough, the red herring of religious squabbles across the bloody trail of native persecution. The spokesmen of the Belgian Roman Catholic Mission in Belgium, however, are no less emphatic in their protests at the obstacles thrown in the way of Christian propaganda on the Congo than are the Protestant missionaries. Towards the latter, King Leopold's policy is one of open hostility. Round some of the mission stations he is making a waste. He refuses to sell new sites for extension of work. We emphatically protest against the repeated refusal to sell sites for mission stations to our societies, says a protest and appeal signed by 52 evangelical missionaries of all nationalities, representing the totality of their brethren, perhaps some 150 in all, assembled in conference at Stanleypool on January the 16th of this year. He offers impossible sites for leases on impossible terms. In 1898, the Congo Balolo mission desired to open up on the Juapa River. Permission was granted. Difficulties follow. The game of Jekyll and Hyde is time-honoured on the Congo. Finally, the party of missionaries were turned off by force. They were not permitted a glimpse into the interior of the Domaine de la Couronne, through which the Juapa flows. They were kept off the region where bloom the lilies or eternal peace, by a hedge of rifles and cap guns. When it is remembered, wrote Dr. Guinness to Lord Lansdowne on the 29th of November 1905, in a letter recounting the grievances of his mission at the hands of the Regenerator of Africa, that the Juapa River, with its 32 tributaries, is comparable in importance to the Danube in Europe, it will be understood how serious, from a missionary standpoint, was the expulsion of the agents of the Congo Balolo mission from the site of Bonyeka which they had selected. During the correspondence, a map was kindly sent us with one site indicated where we were graciously permitted to settle, but this site corresponded accurately with an uninhabitable, low-lying, fever-stricken swamp. 3 years ago, Morrison, the sturdy and eloquent missionary from Virginia, a man whom to know is to trust, after vainly appealing to King Leopold to redress the wrongs inflicted upon the wretched natives round Luebo, came home and denounced the crimes there perpetrated to the world. Then he went to Brussels and bearded King Leopold's principal secretary in his his thickly carpeted, heavy-curtained office, where reigns an air of mystery, where converse is the art of fence, where the visitor's chair is so placed that the light may fall upon its occupant's features, while the inscrutable gentleman with the pince-nez, tall, slim, très correct, and excessively subtle, reclines in discreet shadow. There, amongst other complaints, he protested against the withholding of mission sites. Here was an opportunity. A few days later, all the subsidised organs rang with the news that Morrison had been pursuing material interests and, failing to secure them, had launched his accusations. He was an infamous calumniator like the rest. When HBM Consul Mr. Roger Casement visited in the summer of 1903 the station of the Congo Balolo mission at Bongandanga in the ABIR territory, he found that the missionaries were being made unwilling and helpless accomplices in the illegal system, since condemned by the Commission of Inquiry, and persisted in, of forced levies of foodstuffs upon the natives by the officials of that concern. All free dealing in articles of food between missionaries and natives had been prohibited. You see, the missionaries were then writing home, denouncing the atrocities perpetrated in their neighbourhood, and this was the first form which their punishment took. Not even an egg could the missionaries buy from the natives. All their supplies they were compelled to purchase through the ABIR, which procured them by the usual method sacred to Congo custom. Consul Casement protested energetically to the Governor-General. I have a right to request, and one that I would urge with most respectful insistence, that my fellow countrymen residing in any part of the Congo state should not be forced, in order to have food for themselves and households, to share in measures which are repugnant to the most vulgar sentiments of civilized society. voluble assurances were given and broken, and for 18 months afterwards, until the repeated representations of the Congo Reform Association to the Foreign Office put a stop to the practice, the British missionaries were persecuted in all sorts of ways. Their food supplies were stopped altogether. The natives were forbidden to sell them anything on pain of instant punishment. Natives were shot and imprisoned for contravening these instructions. Their fowls were stolen. They were forbidden to cut wood without paying exorbitant fees. They were insulted and even threatened by the ABIR officials, one of whom became so violent that the British consul, 1,000 miles away, insisted upon an armed guard being placed on their premises under an Italian officer. As recently as the beginning of this year, a party of British missionaries itinerating in the Upper Lomako region received written communications couched in the most insolent terms, and in very bad French, from the local representative of the ABIR, ordering them to clear out. Here are passages from these letters. The company, e.g. the ABIR, being domaine privé, you have no right to sojourn therein. Your voyage to the upper river cannot take place overland without the authorization of the director of the ABIR company at Basankusu. The latest form of persecution to which British missionaries are subject consists in that of prosecution for criminal libel for reporting evidence tendered before the Commission of Inquiry in open court, which evidence, as I have explained further back, has been suppressed because King Leopold is frightened that capital might be made out of it by the author of this volume. In reality, because he knows that that evidence, if produced, would stagger European public opinion. Mr. Stannard is the first victim of this ingenuity, and at the very time these farcical legal proceedings were in process, his nominal prosecutor, the chief of police of the district, was making use of the press bureau in Brussels to propagate throughout the world charges of incitement to rebellion, incendiarism and murder against the defendant, and another missionary, Mr. Whiteside. Moreover, a new law has been passed whereby any missionary who reports to a government official or to a judicial official outrages committed or allowed to be committed by a white man is liable to be tried for defamation and sentenced to 5 years' imprisonment. As I write these lines, letters from the Congo inform me that native evangelists attached to British mission stations have been turned off the Bosombo River and forbidden to enter the region, where probably some devilry more pronounced than usual is taking place. This sort of thing cannot be allowed to go on. The British government is morally bound to insist that from this day forward the British missionary societies shall, in accordance with the terms of the Convention, extend their civilizing labours where they like, aye, even in that heart of that inalienable Holy of Holies, the Domaine de la Couronne, erect new stations at suitable sites, not pestiferous swamps, have perfect freedom of dealing with the natives, and generally benefit by the rights secured to the subjects of this country. British consular officers should be increased, and the slightest infraction of British rights should be at once reported when the remedy is in our hands. I prefer, whenever possible, to quote the utterances of British statesmen when referring to what Britain can do under certain contingencies, because a man who has led a campaign of denunciation and exposure is always liable to be called extreme. On this occasion I venture to quote Lord Fitzmaurice, who, speaking in the House of Commons in 1904, said, "He would venture to remind the Congo Free State how easy it would be for Europe, or indeed for any state that chose, to practically put an end to its existence by sending a few ships to the mouth of the Congo. The Congo Free State lay absolutely at the mercy of this country, or any country which chose to say that it would occupy the capital of Boma in the name of civilization. It would not be necessary to occupy Boma, a single man of war stationed at the mouth of the lower Congo with orders to prohibit the entry or departure of steamers or craft of any kind, would be quite sufficient to bring King Leopold to his knees, if not to his senses. The blood-stained rubber in the outgoing vessels would be late for the Antwerp market, and the shares of the trusts would collapse. And in 6 weeks, King Leopold's officials at Boma would be howling for the supplies contained in the steamers due. Imagine the superior Congo official at the capital deprived of his tinned delicacies, even though of Chicago manufacture, sweet champagne and vermouth. It is too horrible to contemplate. Lord Fitzmaurice is perfectly accurate. King Leopold's African enterprise lies at the mercy of this country. He has broken every promise he made us under the declarations and the convention, instruments which concern us and us alone. To sum up, we recognised a benevolent and civilising enterprise, not a piratical undertaking, and it is open to us to refuse steamers flying a piratical flag access to our waters, and to give the king's mischief-making consuls in this country their congé. We were given pledges that our subjects on the Congo would be assured of justice and protection. They received neither, and we are entitled to establish consular jurisdiction. We were given pledges that our merchants should be unhampered in the conduct of their business. The only elements in the country in which they could conduct commercial transactions have been appropriated by the king. Our missionaries were guaranteed unfettered liberty in the pursuit of their noble aims. They are interfered with, and now they are being persecuted for telling the truth. On both these grounds we are justified in taking drastic and immediate measures for the preservation of our incontestable rights. Heaven knows we have waited long and patiently, and put up with flouts and jeers, which we should have brooked from no first or even third-rate power. And what is our right has become our manifest duty in the general cause of civilization and humanity. Having passed in review the various forms which British action can now take under our treaty rights with King Leopold, let us examine successively the position Britain enjoys as a co-signatory with other powers in the Act of the West African Conference of 1885. Her situation in the world today, the instrument which that Act provides in the event of the infringement of its clauses, and the considerations of weight which urge her to assume an energetic initiative. I may be permitted, perhaps, at the outset, to state with deliberate conviction, which others can take at their own evaluation, but which has not been arrived at without consulting continental acquaintances, whom I believe to be well informed, that a decisive step by this country under her own treaty rights, on one or several of the lines indicated above, would in itself precipitate that renewed international conference which Lord Lansdowne formally invited in 1903. I have been repeatedly assured by men whose statements cannot be dismissed that the ill success of the British note of 1903 was due, apart from the circumstance that our prestige was not, perhaps, particularly high just then, to the belief rightly or wrongly entertained by continental statesmen that the British government was not in earnest in the matter, that it had obeyed a sudden and forcible mandate from an uninstructed House of Commons, and that its demonstration was of the Platonic order. Students of the Congo question will remember that the attitude of the British government subsequent to the issue of the note was not precisely calculated to remove that impression. They will also recollect that the issue of the note and the later communications of Consul Casement's report to the co-signatory powers led to a pilgrimage on the part of King Leopold to the European courts and to the Elysee, to a systematic and extraordinarily active campaign in 3 languages on the part of the Press Bureau, representing the agitation in England as confined to a small group of bitter and interested persons, the House of Commons as victimised by false information, and Consul Casement as an unreliable half fanatic, half adventurer, and to the dispatch of sundry impartial investigators to the Congo who traversed the consul's charges, described the missionaries as perjured liars, the state of affairs on Congo as one of Elysian bliss, and the system erected by King Leopold a species of African Saint-Simonism, et ainsi de suite. That these concerted efforts, coupled with the impression mentioned, did at any rate affect continental opinion is unquestionable. The position which Britain holds as one of the signatories of the Act of the West African Conference is one of quite exceptional moral strength as compared with that of most of the other signatories, both as regards the historical part she played before and during the elaboration of the clauses of the Act, and in respect to her standing as a tropical African power and a great commercial power with thousands of miles of frontier running parallel to the Congo Free State in various directions. To a greater extent than is the case with any one of the other signatory powers is it possible to affirm that but for British acquiescence there would have been no Congo Free State. The position of France, Germany, and Portugal alone, of the other signatory powers, approaches in importance that of Great Britain. France, because of her long contiguous frontier, the fact that she holds a considerable proportion of the converted Congo stock, loan of 1888, and by the right of preference or preemption which King Leopold, without the consent or recognition then or since of the other powers, made over to her in the event of Belgium definitely declining to annex, and the Congo Free State coming, as it were, on the international market. Portugal, because of her contiguous frontier, which does not greatly affect the question, her frontiers being unoccupied, as is the case with France to a large extent. Germany, because of contiguous frontiers, the fact that she is a great commercial nation, and the circumstance that it was in reply to a German invitation and in the German capital that the West African Conference was held. Few will dispute that the prestige of Great Britain in the councils of the world has seldom stood higher than it does at this moment, the ally of the risen sun in the Far East, on terms of close political entente with France, of sound friendship with Italy, of historic friendship with Portugal, of friendship cemented by royal family ties with Spain, Denmark, and Norway, all three powers, the latter with Sweden, of course, signatories to the Act, of blood relationship with the United States, which, although they did not ratify the Act, sent representatives to it who played an active part in the discussion of the protocols, did ratify the Brussels Act, and were the first to recognise the flag of the International Association. These connections give an aggregate of moral force to Britain which, if she but chooses to put her shoulder to the wheel and use the resources of her diplomacy to the utmost, ought to prove irresistible. The only cloud on the horizon is, or is supposed to be, Germany. But not only has the first diplomatist in Europe taken in hand the improvement of our relations with that power, but there are indications in several quarters of a rapprochement which, minus a few fire-eaters, is desired by both peoples. Apart from this, the protests of the German Chambers of Commerce, of the German Colonial Society, with its 30,000 membership, and of other public bodies in Germany against King Leopold's African pretensions are on record, and if those protests have not been renewed of late, it is not because the situation which caused them to be uttered has become modified, but because the general political relationship between Germany and Great Britain has led to the suppression of all manifestations calculated to support British policy in any part of the habitable globe. But the policy of Germany in tropical Africa is chiefly commercial. She seeks, as we do, outlets for her commerce, and in that respect her true interests and ours in those regions are identical, now as they were in 1885. It is only reasonable to assume, therefore, that by earnest representations to the co-signatory powers, in hands so sound as those which hold the thread of our foreign affairs today, accompanied by a friendly notification of our intention to enforce strictly and without further delay our own treaty rights, the British government can bring about a conference of the powers if it will. It is perhaps less a matter of what we can do than it is whether we should do it. The cons appear to be, first, that England may herself have been guilty of infringing the letter of the Act of the West African Conference. Secondly, that as a nation our hands in Africa are not clean. Thirdly, that King Leopold, if we drive him too hard, may succeed in embroiling us with some other power. With the last con is mixed up a great deal of excessively vague talk about pan-Germanism, secret treaties, Belgian independence, fortification of Antwerp, and what not. It seems to me that the third and last objection is unworthy of consideration by a great nation, in the face of a clear duty which brooks no denial, and discussion of its various phases would lead us into an essay on contemporary European politics far removed from the objects of the present volume. It is sufficient to remark that King Leopold plays a splendid game of bluff, and that if he can bluff our statesmen into believing that he holds all sorts of terrible cards up his sleeve, which he can remove therefrom and brandish over their heads like a sword of Damocles, paralysing their action at pleasure, he will certainly do so. But it is ranking our statesmen rather low, and the idea will be greeted with the most pronounced scepticism and incredulity by Englishmen of all parties. That King Leopold is a dangerous man and a malignant enemy, we know. That he is utterly unscrupulous and immoral alike in his public as in his private life, we know also. But in Europe he is the constitutional monarch of a small neutral state, not an autocrat ruling by force and violence. As such, his capacity for intrigue and evil has definite limitations, and in the interests of his dynasty he must needs keep them within bounds. So far as the first objection is concerned, two very pertinent facts can be pointed out. The first is that the few concessions given in British East Africa, which, it is hardly necessary to say, are totally at variance with King Leopold's system, were given while Lord Lansdowne was in the government, and that Lord Lansdowne is the author of the note to the signatory powers suggesting a further conference. This does not look as though we had done anything very dreadful which need hamper our action on the Congo. The second fact is that Lord Percy, speaking in the House 2 years ago, declared that Great Britain was perfectly willing to submit the terms of those concessions to an international tribunal, with a view to ascertaining if they could in any way be regarded as infringing the Act of 1885. The second objection has always struck me as lamentably weak. In the first place, the main purpose of the West African Conference of 1885 was to deal with the territories of the Congo Basin, and a renewed conference arising out of the violation of the clauses of the Act would obviously be confined to the same programme. Aside from this, the argument would, as Mr. Bennet stated with such admirable force in the House last July, if pressed to its conclusion, stultify all human effort towards improvement. To contend, moreover, that any political errors or individual abuses which have occurred in tropical African dependencies are in any sense of the word comparable with the system of pillage and destruction deliberately wrought on the Congo by King Leopold and his associates in the interest of private profit, is to exhibit a lack of proportion and absence of mental balance beyond the boundaries of reasonable discussion. The hands of no colonialising power are clean in the sense that no colonialising power has been free from political error or political injustice, and that no colonialising power has been free from the presence of incompetent and vicious servants among its personnel in colonies or dependencies. Shameful things have been done in British, French and German Africa, especially in time of war, and when those shameful things have come to light, public opinion has denounced them and insisted upon redress. But here is no question of the occasional backslidings which have marked, and ever will mark, especially when passions are aroused locally, the relationship of the forward and backward races of mankind. Here is a policy cynically and ruthlessly elaborated and pursued by one man for his own personal ends, and for the enrichment of a handful of individuals at the cost of untold human suffering. Here is one man living in luxury in Europe, claiming before the world his right to regard the greater portion of Central Africa as his private property, the people inhabiting it as his serfs, the riches it contains as his own, and his power to utilise the labour of the people of the land for the acquisition of those riches, absolute and unquestioned. Here is raid, massacre, mutilation, torture, incendiarism, and destruction visited upon a people, not in a state of war at all, but merely as incidental features in the raising of taxation. Since Pharaoh enslaved the Israelitish nation to minister to his ambitions, there has been no parallel to this. To acquiesce in such a monstrous emendation from a disordered brain, because the millennium has not yet dawned, would be tantamount to committing moral suicide. No, that second objection has only to be dissected in the light of common sense to be rejected. It is worthily inspired, but, if adopted, would lead Christianity to the abyss of self-destruction. End of section 21. Section 22 of Red Rubber, the story of the rubber slave trade on the Congo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. Red Rubber, the story of the rubber slave trade on the Congo, by Edmund Dene Morel. Section 22. The Duty. What Britain Can Do, Part 3. So much for the cons. What of the pros? Above and beyond them all is the great cry for justice and mercy which arises from the Congo forests. Can we be deaf to it, we who are of the race of Clarkson and of Wilberforce? Can we forget our glorious part in the emancipation of the Negro race? Can we forget that our forefathers, in the teeth of parliamentary opposition, class prejudice, mob violence, fought a system hoary with age and sanctified by custom, and carried that fight to a glorious victory? Can we fail to see the finger of God pointing out to us the path we are called upon to tread in the extraordinary coincidence that the real awakening of the British conscience to the great Congo tragedy synchronises with the centenary of the most noble act which our historical annals record? Let us reject with indignant scorn the croaking of the pessimists who tell us that our people have deteriorated and that they have forsworn the ideals of their forebears. Let us prove to them that they are wrong. Let us prove to them that the heart of the nation still beats soundly as of yore by the performance of our plain and simple duty, by saving the races of Central Africa from the grip of the modern slavers. Morally, we would seek in vain to escape from our responsibilities. Materially, Britain has legitimate considerations to invoke which impel her to action in the interests of her own people and in the interests of the communities which in Africa recognise her flag and enjoy her protection. In invoking them, she deals a crushing and irrecoverable blow to the basis of legal shams on which the rubber slave trade seeks at once to justify its existence and hide its veritable character. We know that the subtlety of jurists is seldom at a loss, It can be utilised, and has been utilised again and again in the defence of the indefensible. But before great principles interpreted by the instruments of fairness and plain, straightforward argument, it breaks down. The subtlety of the jurist has been called upon to justify the pillage of the Congo basin and the enslavement of its inhabitants. On the untenable premise, vide section 4, that King Leopold's African enterprise constitutes a state, jurists have evolved the theory that he is entitled to lay claim to the land and the produce of the land, e.g. its realisable wealth, which can be gathered only by the inhabitants of the land, and to delegate in part his ownership of that land and its produce to those upon whom it may please him to confer such powers, to you, or I, or anyone. That, be it noted, is the legal or juridical defence of pillage and enslavement in tropical Africa. Its audacity is truly prodigious. It can be met in argument by the simple enunciation of a principle which is, and ever must be, the cardinal feature of all legitimate European enterprise in the African tropics. In those whose labour is alone available for the cultivation of the land and for the harvesting of its natural wealth, in those is ownership of the land and its products vested, and with those, the people of the land, must the white man negotiate on terms of honest commercial dealing if he would acquire those products of which modern industrialism has need. From this fundamental principle, which regulates and directs relationship between the white man and the black in the African tropics, where the white man cannot cultivate the soil or harvest natural wealth, save in the Congo basin since King Leopold's decrees came into force, there can be no derogation. To retreat a single inch in this regard is to leave the door wide open to the buccaneer, the pirate, and the slaver, is to abandon the African tropics to the rapacity of unscrupulous speculators, is to decree the enslavement of the African races by men who sit at home and pocket the dividends, leaving their foul work to be carried out by others. This principle is termed trade. Trade means barter or exchange, between individuals, as between communities, as between nations. It presupposes, and in practice necessitates, the possession on either side of commodities to sell with which to purchase. In the African tropics, the commodities possessed by the inhabitants are the raw products of their plains and their forests, products which they alone can cultivate or gather. When transactions are localized in far inland regions, such as the Congo, involving heavy expenses on the part of the European purchaser of raw produce in conveying it to the nearest port of shipment, the only commodities which the African can offer in exchange for the white man's goods are rubber, ivory, and a few valuable resins, such as gum copal and gum arabic. These are the only articles the white man can purchase and make a profit on, for they are the only ones which will bear the cost of transport to Europe. Be it understood, therefore, that these commodities constitute the wealth actual and potential of the African, apart from and outside of his local wealth, which is represented by the extent of his household, domestic slaves, or more accurately, domestic servants, food plantations, fishing grounds, cattle, if the country is cattle rearing, poultry, and rude industries. Unlike the European in the actual stage of our evolution, the inhabitant of tropical Africa is not, in his normal state, called upon to labour more than is necessary to supply himself and his family with food, shelter, weapons of war and the chase, baskets and nets for fishing, receptacles for culinary and domestic uses, and so forth. Moreover, living as he does under a communistic society, where the chief is at once the head and the father of the clan, his wants if he falls sick, or when he gets infirm and unable to labour, are supplied by the clan. There are no workhouses in the African tropics, and save under the stress of drought or famine due to failure in crops or other cause, there is no poverty. The labour, then, which the Africans may give to other purposes than those of sustaining life in conditions as comfortable as his needs and ambitions dictate, is not necessary to life. Yet throughout the African tropics, wherever and whenever the white man has come with commodities to sell which the native has not possessed, and has become attracted by, the latter has voluntarily grafted upon himself extra labour in order to gather and reap commodities produced by his land which the white man required in exchange for what he brought. In this natural keenness of the African in the great black belt to trade lies at once the keynote to Afro-European relationship in that belt and the explanation of the white man's presence therein. The Phoenicians were the first to recognise the commercial instincts of the West African native, and successive relays of white-skinned peoples have followed their lead. The West Central African trade has grown to great proportions, and with the advent of the iron horse is increasing every year. Its future is incalculable, and in time West Central African production will appreciably affect all the markets of the Western world. The laziness and indifference of the native, to which King Leopold, who has robbed him of countless millions, testified publicly in Brussels last year, is exemplified by the millions of pounds sterling worth of palm oil, palm kernels, mahogany, rubber, gums, wax, piassava, ground nuts, and now raw cotton can be added to the list, which every year is brought to Europe in ocean steamers, products of the voluntary labour of the African in his own land, owner of the soil, owner of its fruits, cultivator in his own right, proprietor of his own mighty muscles. The value of all this produce does return to Africa, for which it proves a source of prosperity, vide section 1, in European and American merchandise, and so the African gives employment to tens of thousands of European workmen and artisans, and provides thousands of European families with the wherewithal to obtain the necessaries of life in the shape of wages arising from the labour of the African thousands of miles away. When the Labour parties of England and the continent have realised that between the labourer at home and the labourer in Africa there is practical community of interest as co-partners in the world's production, constructive assistance in the problems connected with the administration of tropical African dependencies may be expected from them. Now on the Congo, since the decrees of 1891, an altogether different conception prevails. There, as I have said, everything is abnormal. Sitting in his royal palace 5,000 miles removed from his black subjects, whom he has never seen, King Leopold has, with a single stroke of the pen, robbed the native of his entire wealth, actual and prospective, and calmly appropriated it himself. So colossal a theft has never been imagined by mortal man. The rubber which grows in the forest does not belong to the native. It belongs to King Leopold. And so with dead and live ivory, and so with the valuable resins, and so with everything. And observe how this works out, and must work out in practice. I may write down, the contents of the Bank of England belong to Dene Morel. That would be foolishness, would it not? Equally foolish would it be for King Leopold to write down, the wealth of Central Africa belongs to me, if he stopped there. But the regenerator of the Negro race is anything but foolish, and he did not stop there. Having appropriated on paper, he proceeded to acquire in deed. So he claimed the labour of the people to bring him their wealth which he has pirated. There is no need to purchase what belongs to you by virtue of your royal will. So the abnormal replaces the normal. Armed force replaces trade. The revolution is accomplished, and the enslavement of the people, so long as that armed force can be maintained, is complete. It is marvellously simple. The one weak part of the British note to the Powers in 1903 is the paragraph in which the suggestion is put forward that the question of commercial freedom, otherwise trade, as laid down in the Act of the West African Conference, should be separated from the question of the treatment of the natives and referred to the Hague Court. But nothing is more patent than that the two questions are inextricably interwoven. They cannot be separated. They make one. If the right to trade in the produce or his country is taken from the native by a prima facie claim to possession of that produce, ill treatment necessarily follows as night follows day. For such a claim is merely grotesque unless it be enforced, and it can only be enforced by compelling the native to collect that produce through the constant use of armed coercion, involving the inevitable perpetration of incessant outrage, wholesale and detail. To submit the effects of a given cause to one international tribunal, and the cause itself to another, is surely amazing illogicalness. I maintain that it is the duty of the British government, above all governments, to uphold the principle of trade in the African tropics, in the legitimate interests of the people who have entrusted it with power. This is no question of protection versus free trade, of irritation with other powers because they put on differential tariffs against our goods, and we should prefer they did not. It is a question of trade itself, the pivotal element which unites all societies, the link which binds together in a practical sense the various branches of the human family. I can only attribute the peculiar horror which seems to strike some worthy persons at the mere mention of the word trade or commerce in connection with the Congo problem, to ignorance of the essence of that problem, and to forgetfulness that the very existence of this country is dependent upon trade. Trade spells freedom for the inhabitant of the African tropics. Its suppression spells his enslavement by those who deny him the right to own the produce of his country, deprive him of his right to buy and to sell, strangle forever his economic development, force him at the end of the lash and at the muzzle of the rifle to harvest what was once his wealth before they stole it from him, and lay it at the feet of the despoiler. Surely those who label themselves humanitarians, affect to look upon the African as a cross between a babe and a saint, he is neither, and boast of a superior moral sense, should consider this aspect of the matter, if their nerves are unwrought at what they deem the utilitarianism of the other. The plain fact of the matter is that to insist upon the principle of trade relationship between the European and the Negro in his own home as the basic principle in that relationship is synonymous with declaring that the Negro must be treated, not as a half-babe, half-saint, to be petted and veneered with an outward culture altogether foreign to his ideas, leaping over 12 centuries in a few years, as a man with the rights of a man, not as a brute beast. To great commercial nations like England, Germany, and the United States, the closing of the greater part of Central Africa to trade is a blow dealt straight at the legitimate interests of the British, German, and American people by a monarch whose sovereignty over the Congo was recognised by them principally on the ground, vide section 1, that his intentions were to facilitate in every conceivable manner the development and extension of trade. Stanley, speaking at Manchester in 1884 in favour of King Leopold's enterprise, went into flights of rhapsody over the potentialities of the Congo as a market for British manufactured cotton goods. Mr. Frelinghuysen, American Secretary of State, in a letter to Mr. Tisdall, said, "Soon these millions of people inhabiting the interior of Africa will, under the inspiring influence of civilization, become purchasers of every kind of provision, manufactured goods, agricultural implements, etc., and I see no reason why the people of the United States should not come in for a large share of the valuable trade which must soon be developed in this region." Mr. Casson, the American delegate at the conference, congratulated himself that "we secure, by the action taken at Berlin, the abolition of all monopolies, private or cooperative." Monopolies have become one gigantic monopoly, going far beyond a monopoly of trade, which signifies the right of a certain party to be the exclusive purchaser of produce in a given region, involving claim to personal possession of the very elements of trade, thus doing away with the need of purchase altogether. An owner, let it be repeated, is not called upon to purchase what belongs to him. The importance of the rich prospective trade of the Congo Valley has led to the general conviction that it should be open to all nations on equal terms, said President Arthur in his message of December 1884. It is not only closed to all nations, it is extirpated. The fundamental idea of this programme is to facilitate the access of all commercial nations in the interior of Africa, declared Bismarck at the opening of the Congress. Freedom of trade, remarked Lord Vivian at the Brussels Conference in 1890, was established in the interest not only of civilization, but of the native races of Africa. Thus it will be seen that the representatives of the great commercial nations saw nothing to be ashamed of in consecrating aloud the principle of trade in the Congo basin. Why should Englishmen be afraid of upholding that principle today? Lest they be accused of ulterior motives? Where are the ulterior motives? They are not ulterior, they are actual, legitimate, common sense. They should be boldly proclaimed, insisted upon. The British merchant has the right of erecting factories and trading with the natives all over the Congo, even in the Domaine de la Couronne, for all its inalienability. That every square yard of the territory should be claimed by King Leopold and his financiers, and everything of economic value thereon, matters not one jot. The claim is preposterously impudent. British trade, with or without the medium of the British merchant, has the right to penetrate into every corner of the Congo Free State. That King Leopold's principal secretary in Brussels should inform the British government, in effect, that trade is impossible on the Congo because there are no longer any unappropriated lands there, is mere insolence. That the same official should declare in reference to the British note that it confuses the utilisation of his property, that is King Leopold's property, e.g. 800,000 square miles in Central Africa, by the owner, that is King Leopold, with trade, that is the right of the natives to buy and to sell, and that the native who collects on behalf of the owner, King Leopold, does not become the owner of what is so collected, and naturally cannot dispose of it to a third party, is, with the exception of King Leopold's manifesto of 1906, the most cynical avowal of wholesale spoliation ever penned. What? The power to which King Leopold came on bended knees 22 years ago, begging for support, calmly informed today by the same potentate that the British merchant and that British trade are shut out from Central Africa because it has pleased him by a stroke of the pen to substitute himself for the native as the owner of the commercial wealth of Central Africa, and that consequently the native has nothing to exchange for British goods? In very truth, the proposition is laughable in its audacity. To use an historic phrase, enough of this foolery. Aye, and more than enough, for it exercises itself not only at the expense of the legitimate interests of great nations, but at the price of African blood shed in torrents and African misery unportrayable in words. And finally, there is another reason why Britain should decline any longer to recognise the pretensions of King Leopold. To every power holding possessions in the neighbourhood of his fine stations, and in proximity to the operations of his ivory and rubber raiding officials, the seizure and collection by armed forces of his revenues is a positive danger and disturbance. The presence of a lawless, marauding soldiery, ever increasing in numbers, and only held in nominal discipline by the conferring of full freedom to loot and rape, is a menace. The erection of frontier forts armed with heavy guns, a threat. The importation of enormous quantities of ball cartridges and ammunition to make rubber, à la Congolaise, which includes the provisioning of fighting clans with material of war to force rubber in the royal interests from their weaker neighbours, when the regulars are employed elsewhere, is a peril which it would be folly to ignore. Two great rebellions of native soldiery, which brought the Congo Free State almost toppling to the ground, have occurred in the last 10 years. Even the fort at Chinkakasa, just outside Boma, the capital, was seized a few years ago by the garrison, exasperated with the treatment of their women by King Leopold's officials, who, terrified out of their lives, ran hither and thither like scared rabbits for all their gold lace and impeccable ducks. Boma itself being saved from destruction only by the ignorance of the mutineers in the working of the time fuse, and from pillage by the action of a brave British coloured subject of Lagos, who organised his compatriots from the British West African colonies, settled in various capacities at Boma, into patrols, which marched through the town, and who was destined later on to be hounded to a suicide's grave by the malignity of the men he had rescued. Bands of these revolted soldiery had on several occasions invaded and committed havoc in the contiguous British possessions, and to this day hold parts of the Congo territory into which no official dares set foot. Any moment may bring forth another and graver revolt, and any day may see the rise of an intelligent native corporal with a brain above his fellows, some bastard Arab blood in his veins perhaps, who will make a bold bid for empire against the officials of the absentee landlord. And all over the land broods the shadow of a great crime, filling the breasts of the miserable people with an undying hatred of the accursed white man and all his ways. Given the slightest chance at combination, given a leader, given a favourable set of circumstances, and the smouldering embers will burst into a flame, and the conflagration might well spread until every official of the king, with his throat cut, had been flung into the river. It would be a just retribution, for what sort of task would confront the criminal apathy of Europe? Sir Harry Johnston is not given to sensationalism or rash predictions, but this is what he wrote in 1902, 4 years ago, before the charges against King Leopold's enterprise were thoroughly established. If all the stories are true of the wickedness perpetrated in the Congo Free State since 1885, there will some day be such a rising against the white man and such punishment inflicted on European interests in the heart of Africa as will surpass any revolt that has ever yet been made by the black and the yellow man against his white brother and overlord. To watch with philosophic eye this cauldron of native discontent and misery fed with the ingredients of a civilized barbarism go seething on is madness. Arguments drawn from the necessity of keeping up the prestige of the white man in the African tropics do not appeal to me very much, for the surest foundation for the maintenance of such is justice, even-handed, tiger justice, as poor Mary Kingsley used to say. But I often wonder that the white powers can continue their supine contemplation, while deeds are done in the Congo basin which brand with indelible infamy the white race in the eyes of the black, deeds which in Lord Fitzmaurice's words make civilization ashamed of its name, deeds which cry to heaven for vengeance, and for which some day, in the fullness of time, a fearful penalty will be enacted. The Act of the West African Conference provides a weapon which can be wielded against the civilized barbarism introduced by King Leopold, with or without the convocation of a renewed conference of all the signatory powers of that Act, a weapon which requires but 5 of the signatory powers to make up their minds to use. Act 1. That weapon is the Navigation Commission, which has never been invoked, although the essential clauses of the Act have been violated with impunity for 15 years. The question of navigation on the Congo waterways is intimately bound up with the question of the trading rights of European merchants and of the natives, for it is obvious that freedom of navigation is a misnomer if trade is non-existent. Consequently, the general question of maladministration, misrule, and spoliation is also involved. Indeed, the idea entertained by the plenipotentiaries of the powers at Berlin in providing for a navigation commission was clearly concerned with the protection of trade. Thus, M. de Cussereau, one of the German delegates at the conference, declared, Prot. 3, sitting November the 27th, 1884, that in the view of his government, freedom of trade should not be left unsupervised, sans contrôle, and he added, the International Navigation Commission appears to it, the German government, a competent instrument to be provisionally entrusted with this supervision. Moreover, the Act itself, as signed by all the powers, is explicit. Article 25 reads, this provision of the present Act of Navigation shall remain in force in time of war. Consequently, all nations, whether neutral or belligerent, shall be always free, for the purposes of trade, to navigate the Congo, its branches, affluents, and mouths, as well as the territorial waters fronting the embouchure of the river. The powers enjoyed by this commission as provided in the Act would be as considerable as those enjoyed by the Danube River Commission. They would be virtually sovereign powers in regard to everything affecting navigation, and who controls navigation in the Congo basin controls the arteries and veins of the Congo Free State. It is independent of the territorial authorities, Article 20. The powers composing it can have recourse to their own ships of war. It can raise loans, Article 23. In short, the appointment of this commission would be the stepping stone for that wider and closer international control of the Congo, which, failing the possible but unlikely solution of Belgian annexation, on lines acceptable to public opinion, honour and safety alike demand shall no longer be delayed. With these considerations, I bring this chapter and with it this volume to a close. I have indicated the specific courses of action which are open to Great Britain under her own treaty rights, rights which no power would dream of contesting, and I have given expression to a widely spread conviction that the adoption by Great Britain of one or more of the steps denoted would compel international interference. To these I may here add that Great Britain would appear to be entitled, with or without the appointment of a navigation commission, to place a gunboat on the Upper Congo, and that she ought to do it on behalf of her own subjects. And, I hasten to add, other powers would seem to have precisely the same option in that respect. I have given reasons, and no one can deny that they are grave, legitimate, and weighty reasons, why Great Britain should drop the policy of vain expostulation pursued for 10 years, and take energetic measures to abide by, and if necessary to enforce, her treaty rights in her own justifiable interests. And I have proved, I venture to think to the satisfaction of all reasonable persons, that in so acting Great Britain would be serving the general interests of humanity. With respect to the position of Great Britain as one of the signatory powers of the Act of the West African Conference, I have shown how preponderating is that position in regard to the corresponding position of most of the signatory powers, how great is the prestige of Great Britain abroad at the present moment, how immensely important are the issues at stake, how duty and honour summon the British government to a vigorous initiative. Finally, I have drawn attention to the very definite instrument which the Act of the Conference provides for the invocation of practical international control over the vast fluvial system of the Congo. What remains to be said can be embodied in a couple of paragraphs. Nothing impracticable, nothing unrealizable is being demanded on behalf of the Congo natives. No grandmotherly legislation, no sentimental claims are being urged in their interest. Only justice. They have been robbed of their property. We demand that their property shall be restored to them. They have been robbed of their liberty. We demand that their liberty shall be restored to them. They are bound in chains. We demand that those chains shall be rent asunder. For 15 years they have been degraded, enslaved, exterminated. We demand that this shall stop, not 15 years, not 5 years, or 1 year hence, but now. The Congo Free State has long ceased to exist. It has given place to a political monster, an international outlaw. Of that political monster and international outlaw, but one thing can be said or written: Delenda est Carthago. The reek of its abominations mounts to heaven in fumes of shame. It pollutes the earth. Its speedy disappearance is imperative for Africa and for the world. E.D. Morel. End of section 22. End of Red Rubber, the story of the rubber slave trade on the Congo, by Edmund Dene Morel.